Hello guys and welcome back to another video. So as you all probably know, the public PTS patch notes for Morrowind have been recently released, and if you haven't checked them out yet, I recommend doing so. You can find them in the ESO forums, and that'll give you all the changes that are so far planned, though obviously since it's just PTS patch notes they are liable to change, and I imagine some alterations will occur. This is especially true given the drama that's been generated because of the nerfs to sustain, many players thinking it goes too far. Now, in terms of my own opinion, we'll get into that a little bit later, but I just wanted to say that while feedback is useful, be careful not to just depict ZeniMax as some kind of ignorant fool. Some of the changes are definitely well intentioned, and while perhaps they've been carried out a little bit poorly, we need to be a little bit more sympathetic. Things are rarely as black and white as the bandwagon hate train will suggest. With that said, this video is going to be looking at the changes directly relevant to tanking, as that is my area of expertise in the game. So, with that said, let's get into the patch notes right away. The first change I want to bring attention to is that they're reducing the cooldown for being charged stamina or magicka to block an attack to 0.25 seconds from 0.5. In effect, this obviously means you're going to be charged 4 times per second to block an attack, removing the respective resource, making it much more difficult for tanks to block over a longer duration. Now, a response to this change has been the outroar saying, how can we complete Vetral content now because we need to quote-unquote perma-block in order to not die to boss mechanics. Now, I really want to dispute this claim and kind of dispel with it. It's a bit of a myth or a dramatization of what actually happens within trial content. While there are certainly mechanics that will one-shot tanks not blocking, after those mechanics there is almost always a period of a safe time window where you can drop block, heavy attack, channel abilities freely without taking too much damage. With these changes, block uptime is naturally going to be impacted. Now, what I think will happen is that builds will now gravitate towards full sturdy, sturdy being the trait which reduces the cost for you to block, and in addition to that, I think it will be stacked with the Shadow Ward CP passive. Now, there are diminishing returns with that, but ultimately I think even though there are diminishing returns, the investment will be justified, and given how they're changing CP trees up, and we'll see a little bit later, well much later in the review, I think it will work out overall, so should be fine. Now, while this is going to certainly impact the DK Sustain's permablock mentality, I do think it will hit non-DK tanks harder, as they certainly couldn't just permablock given they had lower resource sustain. However, when we look at the other changes that are later implemented in the patch notes, I think it will actually end up promoting better tank build diversity, and hopefully we will see more tank classes at Veteran Trial endgame. The next change is that they're altering how much stamina-based abilities cost universally. Instead of being 20% cheaper to their magic counterparts, they're now 15% cheaper. In practice, this means as a tank, we're going to have to be more careful in using our abilities like Pierce Armor, Heroic Slash, and other stamina-based buffs. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, surely we need to be able to Pierce Armor the boss to tank, right? And while I do get that point, at the same time I think myself, I have been guilty of over-taunting the boss, and so with this patch, it seems to me that tanks are going to have to be very careful with their ability use and pay closer attention to their buff timers, meaning they don't over-taunt or overuse abilities. Now, the next change I want to bring light to is the minor magicka steal change. Now, with Homestead, this was actually a big buff. Minor magicka steal enabled tanks, even with using something like spiked armor, which returns damage to the enemy, to actually proc this and get magicka back, making our sustain quite insane. Now, reducing this to 300 is obviously a nerf, but I think it's still an added benefit and something tanks did not have prior to Homestead, so nothing too much to worry about there. Let's move on and talk about the class-specific changes. Now, Dragon Knight is one that's been altered quite significantly, and Erevan Heart in particular has been targeted by ZeniMax's nerf hammer, so to speak, but I don't think it will be that bad and will certainly be overcome, and DK tanks are certainly still in contention for the kings of tanking moving forwards. Now, with Battle Roar, instead of this passive ability restoring stats based on your max resources when using ultimate ability, it's now going to restore them based on your character level. In practice, as we see from the developer comments, this means if your resources are above 26k, you're going to see a nerf to this passive, but if it's below 26k, we're going to see a buff. Now, what I think this promotes is less resource stacking. With my current in-game DK tank builds, I can get up to 36k stamina with Warhorn, meaning that we're going to see a reduction in stamina, I believe, and an increase into points into magicka, and perhaps even HP to help alleviate for less time spent blocking. Obviously, having a higher HP pool allows us to take bigger hits without dying. It is worth keeping in mind if the meta does change towards promoting recovery tanks more strongly, this is actually an absolute buff, meaning that for recovery tanks you have a lot to be happy about moving forward into Morrowind. Now, building upon that, Helping Hands has also been changed to be based off of max level rather than max stamina. So, this will be a buff if your max stamina is below 20k, and a reduction if it is above, and as I said just then, my characters have 30 to 34k stamina as a tank, so this does mean that we're not going to be benefiting nearly as much as we used to, which, in conjunction with the block cost changes, will make it quite difficult to maintain perma-block, so to speak, and will encourage better uses of blocking and also smarter uses of abilities because our stamina restore isn't that great. In addition, I also expect to be more reliant on external stimulus such as shards and necrotic orbs, but is that necessarily a bad thing? Not really within organized content, but you might struggle if you're in a group that is perhaps not quite as strong because you're less self-sustainable. The major mending component of Igneous Shields has also been changed. Instead of being an independent buff of Igneous Shields, now when Igneous Shields drops off, you'll also lose major mending. I think this is primarily a PvP change, but for PvE what this means as a tank, since we're taking a lot of damage constantly, that the Igneous Shields major mending buff is not going to empower our Vigour, which is what DK tanks and tanks in general use to heal our group. It's not going to empower our Vigour as much as it used to. However, I still think we'll get a few ticks of major mending, meaning that we'll only lose maybe 2 to 3 ticks of that major mending buffed Vigour in total. It's worth keeping in mind though that when we consider this in conjunction with the sustain nerfs, that ultimately tanks are not going to be able to provide the same level of group support with their healing that they used to be able to prior to Morrowind. Moving on to Nightblades, they have not escaped the sustain nerfs either. So if you've ever played a sap tank build or even my Ice Staff tank build, you'll know that Nightblades, at least tanks, are incredibly dependent on their Siphoning Strike's ability. So it's a bit of a shame that ZeniMax decided to nerf it, as I certainly thought it was a very nice way to enable Nightblades to fulfill a niche tanking role. However, let's talk about the changes. So the unmorphed version of Siphoning Strikes now restores HP instead of magic or stamina. Now the reason I think they've done this is twofold. First off, for new players who are questing in solo, this extra bit of HP might mean a difference between them dying or living, so a new player experience benefit. In addition to that, because we're dropping block more as a tank it seems, the extra HP we're getting on our light attack waves might allow us to take bigger hits and live. In terms of increasing the duration, this brings the ability in keeping with current long buffs that tanks use, such as Shuffle, such as our major resistance buffs, which I think is a positive change as it enables more efficient bar swaps and allows us to bar swap to refresh all the buffs at the same time, rather than having some weird staggered approach which Nightblades had to take in the past, which necessitated more bar swaps. And the short story of that is that more bar swaps equals more chance for error, so I think it's certainly a nice change. However, when it comes to the morphs, we now have to pick between a stamina morph or a magicka morph, dependent on what resource we want back. I also think, at least from what I can see with the text, that they've nerfed it so that we're no longer getting resources back when we use abilities and only from light attacks. This means we'll be restoring a significantly less amount of resources, so we're going to have to be more careful with the abilities we use. However, I do think that the ability to control which resource you get back will help with the new synergy system they're implementing, which we'll talk about later. As it stands with the current changes, it's rather interesting that Sorcerer has been relatively untouched with the Morrowind patch, at least as it stands with this public PTS patch notes. And once again, to reiterate, anyone can see these are publicly available, so do go check them out in detail if you want more than just a tank perspective. Now, with this Dark Exchange, they've made it so there's a 0.2 seconds of animation blending time, which effectively means, as you see here, that you cannot cast other abilities while this 0.2 seconds is completing after the ability has been cast. This means that there's less ability to kind of animation cancel, I suppose, and is, as they say, in keeping with the other channels. Now, one of the things I actually think might be viable is that Sorcerer tanks may see a resurgence in popularity. Because of all the nerfs to sustain, it's interesting that Dark Exchange has not been nerfed, and that restores a significant amount of resources as a tank. Because we're now being encouraged to drop block between time windows that are safe to do so, Dark Exchange can be viably cast, and so we might see a meta where Sorcerers at least can have a little bit more of the pie, so to speak, and it's something I'm excited about. However, I'm not going to get ahead of myself, as these patch notes are liable to change, and well, we might just see that ZeniMax perhaps missed this, though fingers crossed and touch wood, that does not happen, as certainly it would be fun to see a bit more diversity when it comes to endgame tanking. Anyways, let's move on to Templars. Understandably, the changes to Templar are probably the most sensationalized of them all, and that is because it not only changes how the synergy system works by changing their class, but it also removes some of the unique aspects of Templar healing which made them so powerful. However, this video is specifically talking about how this impacts our tanking. Consequently, I'm not going to go into all of the criticisms, especially those directed towards healing and damage dealing, as it's not the focus of this particular video. So looking at Spear Shards, this has been changed so that the synergy from this ability and its morphs now restores stamina or magicka dependent on which percentage of your own resource pool is lower, so the guy actually activating the synergy. Also, it's going to be based on character level instead of max resources, which is in keeping with the DK changes we looked at earlier. It's not encouraging max stat stacking as much as it used to. While this is most definitely a nerf to the amount of resources we're getting back, because tanks didn't have that large resource pools, and especially if the meta switches to a more recovery focused or less stat pool orientated tanking style, this might actually mean we end up getting more bang for our buck, so to speak, in terms of how it feels to activate the synergy, though obviously absolute values will probably decrease. Similarly, Necrotic Orbs is another way for us to get stamina or magicka back, though they share a cooldown with Spear Shards. I think this is great for diversity, but we're not going to get into that as it is quite controversial, as it does remove some of the uniqueness of Templar. One of the areas where they still are unique though is Luminous Shards, and we see here that it's going to restore an equal amount of magic or stamina to the casting Templar dependent on what the player who activated the synergy got. This means that stamina or magicka Templar tanks could have another way of sustaining the resources in a way they didn't have access to prior, so potentially a nice change. Because of the changes to Necrotic Orbs, they're also having it share a synergy cooldown with Spear Shards, meaning that you can only activate one and then you have to wait until you can activate one or the other again. You can't activate both like you used to be able to do. This means that in lower end groups with less synergies, the Alkosh uptime, for example, proc sets which proc off of synergies will probably go down a bit, but in more competent groups there's more than enough synergies to ensure you can maintain your Alkosh debuff. Restoring Light Tree also received a few other minor and some not so minor changes. So with Mending, you're going to be doing 6 and 12% extra healing, depending on the target's missing health, up from 5 to 10%. Now, that is a slight benefit. With Repentance, they've changed this dramatically. So Repentance is a nice way for tanks to be supported. They could get stamina back if a Templar cast this, however that's no longer the case. Now you can only get it back if you're the one casting the ability, meaning Templar tanks can still utilize it, but it means that other tanks can no longer be supported in the same way they used to be by Templars running Repentance. Really, this change is pretty much nullified in many people's opinion, and in mine to an extent, the usefulness of Repentance. I think it only really works out now in solo situations, to be honest, as just restoring HP is not really enough to justify it, and other abilities are perfectly competent and really strong at restoring HP to your group. The only thing you could say is that perhaps with the nerfs to sustain, restoring health for free effectively could be a benefit if people can no longer cast their heal abilities as often. Yet to see how that pans out. They also say that this will be a buff in terms of how much you get back, because it is based on your character level, so perhaps, Templar tanks running this with lower stamina pools will benefit from this change, but once again the absolute numbers will be decreased. Now with Rushed Ceremony and its morphs, they now heal friendly targets in a 180-degree cone in front of you. So for Templar tanks, I think this actually isn't that big a deal, because often when you're tanking a boss, you're facing it away from the group. This means that the group should be in a 180-degree cone in front of you, meaning that the changes here to Rush Ceremony are not that big a deal whatsoever for tanking, and are probably only an issue when it comes to things like Vet DSA and 4-man content. For Trials, I'm confident this will still work out pretty well as much as it functioned in the past, though obviously Templar tanks weren't exactly the bread and butter of tanking. Anyways, I wouldn't be too worried about this. I think it's much more a nerf that healers will have to worry about. Oh, and also worth keeping in mind that they haven't changed the values necessarily of the strength of these heals, but when we get down to here, we'll see that Templar healing as a tank has been decreased because they no longer have access to major mending. Instead, they're only getting minor mending. Now this change is reflective of their desire to reduce major mending uptime in general across all classes. However, I feel that because Templars no longer have access to this, their heals in comparison to DK tanks is going to suffer, and consequently one of the unique factors, the fact that Templars could provide so much healing as a tank, is going to be diminished. When we consider in conjunction with this that Warden, at least from what we know, has access to major mending reliably, it does sit a little bit uneasily with me, and I think that they certainly should reconsider this change to Templar, as major mending for me is required when it comes to a healing orientated class. Ultimately, even though they have increased the amount of heals you get from minor mending percentage wise, it's not going to lead to Templars having the same impact and support role that they used to be able to do prior to Morrowind. That's it for the class changes. Let's now move on to armor. So with most tank setups, we're going to be utilizing one piece of light armor, either 5 pieces or 1 piece of medium armor, and 5 pieces or 1 piece of heavy armor, with heavy armor being the more dominant choice in terms of your 5 pieces. So with light armor and medium armor, they've reduced our sustain by increasing the ability cost effectively of anything, and by that I mean they're reducing the amount of discount we get by a percentile per armor piece, as you see here, 1 to 2% instead of 2 to 3%. Also, and this is probably the more interesting part and impactful one, is that the Constitution passive has been nerfed. So that's a passive which restores Magicka and Stamina stats to you whenever you're hit. Now this has been reduced by approximately 42%, so this will mean that our sustain is going to be impacted, and in keeping with what we talked about with the block changes, overall will necessitate less time spent blocking and more time spent heavy attacking or having synergies fed to you, or some other way of restoring resources like I talked about with Sorcerer and Dark Deal. This does obviously mean that recovery builds might come in a little bit more popularly than they have been in the past, and certainly there are recovery-based tank builds out there that I've been familiar with, though obviously haven't taken into trials because they haven't been the absolute most competitive build, at least prior to Morrowind, so we'll have to see how that pans out. Overall though, definitely a nerf, no way to look at it otherwise, and I do once again think this is primarily a nerf directed towards PvP balance. Rather unfortunate, but we will have to cope with it. And I think it's worth mentioning at this point that even all these changes seem to rock the status quo significantly. It's understandable to be upset. It's really a human reaction to react with hostility towards things which challenge your kind of happy status quo. You're happy with your current playstyle in the game. I think that ultimately we will adapt as a player base, and in a few weeks we'll have an array of new builds, hopefully, which will, I guess, enliven the game and break up the meta, which has been a little bit stale, especially for tanking. The meta for tanking hasn't changed much in the past year or so. With that said, let's move on to, okay, so here Undaunted. Now, I've already talked about this. Necrotic Orb is getting changed so that it now interacts similarly to shards. Don't have to go too much into that. It's just a way of non-Templar support classes in providing this. Obviously, no, not quite as good as Luminous Shards because you're not getting back the resource if a tank was casting this. You're not getting anything back when an ally synergizes it. Now, one of the quite impactful changes here actually for meta tanks, because if you're not familiar with meta tanking, Vigour is a very popular ability for tanks to use. By increasing the cost of this ability, and it's more by 30%, this means that overall the group support tanks can provide will decrease significantly because we can no longer invest so much stamina into casting this ability. For tanks, there is no question in my mind that the uptime on Vigour will definitely decrease. I think this will be reflected in a general playstyle for tanks, a general change in playstyle, where tanks are now focused less on group support and a little bit more focused on self-sustain and keeping their resources up. Of minor significance to tanking is also that Caltrops has been changed. They can now stack with each other, meaning that tanks could potentially use this as an initial aggro tool, casting it in a particular part of the battlefield where enemies spawn to ensure that they instantly hit you instead of a DPS before you get taunt onto them. The reason tanks didn't use this in the past is because one Caltrops would overwrite the other, meaning that stamina DPS Caltrops would be effectively negated if a tank was running it. There's also been some changes to the racials, and remarkably the best sustain race for tanking, Argonian, has been buffed. So the resourceful passive, which restores health, magicka, and stamina when you pop a pot, extra stats back when you use a potion, is now based on your character level rather than your max resource level. And you might think this is a nerf, but when we look at the developer comment, it says this will be a buff for each particular resource if your maximum is below 38,500 and a nerf if it is above. And what I know about tanking, and what you probably know as well, is that none of our resources are ever higher than that in almost every build. This means that the amount of resources we're getting back when we're using Argonian on our tank is going to be a lot better. And in that regard, it will help alleviate, if you pick Argonian for your tank, some of the nerfs that have happened with Morrowind. So perhaps people will be rerolling Argonian on all of their tanks, though luckily for me at least, I do have Argonian on a fair few of my tanks. The champion system rebalancing is the final large change that they've made which will impact tanking. So one of the initial things they've done is that they've made it so that when you invest points into a particular passive in the CP tree, you're going to get more value from it, and there's going to be more severe diminishing returns as you progress towards the maximum percentage you can get. Now, because ZOS has recognised that not all passives were created equal more or less and that some are more powerful, they've also altered the max percentages we can get. So for example, here we see that there's now a 15% passive group, a 25% passive group, and all the way up to 55%. I think this is a good change, but it also is going to have impact on our tanking. So Hardy and Elemental Defender are getting nerfed, meaning we're going to be taking more damage as a tank. Likewise, quick recovery is being reduced to 15%, reducing the amount of healing we receive by 10%. They're also reducing tenacity, and even though I thought they'd be encouraging heavy attacks, we're getting less resources now back on our fully charged heavy attacks, which is a weird change. Mooncalf and Arcanist are also being altered, and while Mooncalf wasn't the best for tanks in general, these sword and board tanks, this means that our recovery overall is going to be declining, which obviously is going to have further impact on our sustain. However, Shadow Ward is still maintaining at 25%, meaning that we can get our block reduction a lot easier, especially with a front-loaded CP change, meaning we only have to invest a few points, or comparatively few, to get a reduction. A more impactful change, though, is the addition of the Ironclad passive, or more the change of it, to reduce damage taken from direct damage abilities by up to 25%. I believe that this change will help counteract the more damage we're taking due to the nerfs to Hardy and Elemental Defender, meaning that we could actually be 10% more tanky effectively, assuming there is no kind of diminishing returns inherent in this system and there's no cap, which will allow for tanks to feel safer in dropping block to restore resources. A big change is that Magician and Warlord no longer reduce the cost of Magicka and Stamina-based abilities respectively. When taken in conjunction with the decreases to sustain, pretty much symptomatic of the Morrowind patch, this does mean that sustaining our resources as a tank will be significantly more difficult and will require more careful use and considerate use of our abilities. I think perhaps they will scale down this though, in terms of the overall sustain nerfs, because it seems a bit much. A final point to consider is that Expert Defender is being buffed to a 35% total bonus that you can get. Now, Expert Defender reduces the damage we take from light and heavy attacks, and this could be something we could actually allocate points into in specific scenarios. What comes to mind is VEA with lots of axes on us to reduce the damage the light attacks are doing, and also their heavy attacks if we accidentally take one we're not blocking. There is certainly some potential with this passive now that it's been increased in terms of effectiveness, so it will be interesting to see how it pans out. And I think because of the lack of blocking within Morrowind, or at least the amount of projected blocking based on these patch notes, it could actually help alleviate quite a bit of damage within trial fight environments. That's it for the patch notes, at least on your screen. Now there's a few other things I want to touch on. With all these sustain nerfs, it has got me thinking about whether tank swapping might become more popular. So you have a main tank who tanks until his resources are more or less spent, and then you have the off tank come in and do likewise and then rinse and repeat. That does mean though that the main tank and off tank builds will probably become more standardized and similar to each other, but it will be interesting to see whether that evolves. Far too early to say so at this point in time though. In addition, based on what we know about Warden and their ability to provide group resistance buffs, I do wonder if tanks will stop running these self-resistance buffs, and instead Warden will provide them to the group, which will save tanks some ability cost in terms of not having to use abilities to self-buff themselves resistance-wise. Could be an interesting change. I also wonder whether resource juggling with having an Ice Staff back bar and Sword and Board front bar to juggle between Magicka and Stamina dependent on which recovery you want to activate could become a new way to tank, or at least more popular, but I guess we'll find out later on, as with all these kind of suggestions. So that concludes my patch review of the public PTS Morrowind patch notes. Please do let me know what you thought about them. Also, if I missed something, be sure to highlight that, or perhaps I overlooked something which is actually quite significant for tanking. I would also love to hear your opinion in general on the patch notes. Did they miss the ball here, or have they actually done some really good stuff with these Morrowind patch notes? As always, feedback is great, and I think the more you spread your feedback, the more ZOS is going to listen to and change the Morrowind patch notes to reflect that, and they might even realise that some of their nerfs to sustain are perhaps going a bit too far. As for my own opinion, to put it in a nutshell, hopefully you got from this, I think there are some good intentions, but also some pretty extreme nerfs, and without a doubt, irrespective, I think, of the way that the patch notes eventually go into live Morrowind, when the Morrowind officially comes out, I think that tanking will dramatically change moving into the future, which for me is going to break up that stale meta, and I look forward to relearning how to tank and learning how to perfect the craft, so to speak, once again. Anyways, guys, thanks again for watching, and especially if you've made it this far, you really help support the channel, and I'll see you all in another video, hopefully not too far away. Bye bye for now.